And then finally, Michael, how can permaculture and whole system design keep us rooted as the world shifts?
Well, I see the future as nuts. I see nut trees being planted everywhere. I see chestnuts, I see hickories, I see hazelnuts. I see their roots holding the soil together. I see them supporting the water cycles above as below. I see an opportunity to stack functions when we're planting trees to make them multi-purpose. It's a lot of projects, a lot of energy going into planting trees. So what if we made those nut trees? What if we made more of those food trees at the same time? This supports wildlife, it creates shelter and habitat for humans, animals alike. We work with permaculture. Permaculture is a word that combines permanent agriculture. It works with holistic design. It brings together landscapes, it brings together people, economies in ways that imitate natural ecosystems. So natural ecosystems flourish with centropy. They feed themselves and they create surplus. So permaculture observes those healthy ecosystems and says, okay, now how do we design on our landscapes? How do we go out and start planting a tree that is supported by its own system like nature does, right? That's the nutshell. Now, to these ends, I've helped co-found an initiative called Silvoculture, which is working toward helping get 1 million nut trees planted here in the Mid-Atlantic region of the U.S. And silvoculture is a play on words, silva meaning forest and culture meaning us that steward the trees in the forest. Just like permaculture is permanent agriculture, ways that we can work with transitioning these fields of soy and corn and monocrops to forests that feed us as well, that bring back the waterways and the rivers, that bring back the communities, that give habitat and shelter to us. So a lot of it is looking at how can we make this idea economically viable, right? How do we change those corn and soybean and all these monocrop fields to, healthy, thriving food forests? So silviculture and a lot of the work I do is focused on how to make this realistic economically. And it actually is very easy. Nuts, bring in a very high demand. They bring in good income. So really it's just the vision and bringing things together. And that's what I'm focused on. Our landscapes are dictated by our economy. What's on our plate. What we're eating is what our landscape looks like. So to be realistic about transitioning to more perennial, more regenerative ways of growing on our landscapes, it needs to make economic sense. It needs to be economically viable. We also need to look at our diets. We need to look at what we're eating. If we're eating all of these heavy processed annual foods, that's what our landscapes are going to look like. So there's a combination of things here, economy and culture. Maybe the economy is a little easier to deal with, so maybe we'll focus on that. And transitioning, so I lived 20 years in rural Latin America, working with food security, food forest systems, and there the situation is that they've been pretty much dictated to grow rice, beans, and corn. And so when you are trying to see how to transition into diversity, you have to take into consideration the reality that they're living in now. And so what we did was we said, okay, we'll keep growing what you're growing because that's what you're eating, what you're relying on, but let's begin to diversify around the edges. Around your dryland rice, let's start planting mangoes, let's start planting avocados, let's start planting macadamia nuts. Let's start diversifying, not necessarily completely transplanting what you're accustomed to, but let's slowly begin to transition something new. That creates food security, because when annual crops fail, because they're much more sensitive to inclement weather changing, right? The perennial food source will be there, number one, for food security, but then you create market niches, right? You've got something to sell off season. And if you get like 5 or 6 different grafted types of mangoes, you've got them producing at different times of the year, so you're creating income. So once you start creating income, good income from those perennials, you're like, hey, I'm going to do some more of that. I'm going to plant some more of those trees. And before you know it, your annual slash and burn crops are gone, and you've got a food forest that's making you tons of money, that's holding the soil, that's bringing in clean water and air, creating shelter and habitat. You can then produce your medicines and go hunting. I mean, it completely changes the landscape. It changes the culture. So our culture is kind of guided by our economics and by our diet. We can change them both. I think it's critical time to be creative. And, creativity can also come from just observing natural, healthy ecosystems. We have the greatest teachers all around us. It's not even something we necessarily have to figure out, but maybe translate, bring indigenous knowledge into modern reality, and that's what permaculture does. And so it's a good pathway to learn about and to follow.